Transform learners into leaders with the School of Federal Leadership Excellence. This new school from Management Concepts offers 2 intensive, unique, and innovative training programs, each designed to teach essential leadership skills to aspiring and mid-level leaders working across the federal landscape, all to help them discover the leadership abilities of tomorrow, today. If you want to develop the skills needed to succeed in the workforce, this is for you. The journey begins at managementconcepts.com. That's managementconcepts.com.
We all have our own behind-the-wheel persona. Are you a windows down, sing-along to your favorite song, seat lean back kind of driver? Or perhaps an AC blasting, podcast on, hugging the wheel kind of driver? However you move through life, Atlantic Union Bank is on board because we agree things should be done your way, especially banking. Work with someone you trust who's there when you need them for all the ways you bank. Call, schedule a video appointment, or make a pit stop at an Atlantic Union Bank branch to learn more. Atlantic Union Bank. Any way you bank.
Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories about the possible impacts on the corruption case against former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan from the U.S. Supreme Court, narrowing the definition of the federal bribery statute, and an announcement from Governor J.B. Pritzker about more taxpayer-funded shelters for non-citizen migrants in Chicago. I'll then join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. A ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court about the federal bribery statute is expected to impact the high-profile trial of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. Madigan was charged with 22 counts of corruption in 2022. He was set to go to trial in April, but with the U.S. Supreme Court taking up a bribery conviction challenge out of Indiana, the judge postponed the trial until October. Wednesday, the Supreme Court issued their ruling. St. Xavier University Professor David Parker said the ruling opens a can of worms by narrowing bribery to something for something before an official act.
And they kind of came back and said, well, if it's merely just a thank you, a gratuity, it doesn't violate the law.
Parker expects the outcome to have some impact on Madigan's case.
So ultimately, it can get him off the hook for some of the charges, but not all of them. So, I think it was wise to kind of wait and then maybe shut the door down to a possible future appeal based on the Snyder ruling.
The ruling isn't expected to affect 15 of the 22 counts against Madigan. Additional taxpayer-supported shelters are set to serve migrants arriving in Chicago. The 2 new shelters and 1 existing shelter will house a total of combined 2,000 people. Katrina Peterson files this report.
Governor J.B. Pritzker made the announcement Tuesday when Chicago residents said she knows all too well what Chicagoans will see as a result of these additional shelters opening up. Cassie Almeida, a resident, fought with Chicago aldermen and residents to shut down a shelter at the Gage Park Fieldhouse.
Being on the trees here outside, having sex in the park in front of kids and everything, I think it's a huge mistake of him trying to open more shelters.
Pritzker said in a news release the additional temporary shelters will ensure that shelter capacity and services remain accessible to asylum seeker families. Almeida said she used to cry on her couch because of the chaos that gripped Gage Park just a few months ago when migrants were sheltering in the Fieldhouse.
And have the government and have the mayor to applaud and accept this disruption here in Chicago, it's terrible.
I'm Katrina Peterson.
Those are the top stories from the past week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, I'll join the Center Square's Dan McCaleb to further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Greg Bishop.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation is bringing you straight news journalism through the Center Square, reporting on state authorities and publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. By supporting the Center Square, you can track politicians' use of taxpayer money and demand transparency from elected officials. This is how we can equip everyday Americans to hold their government accountable. Become a supporter of Franklin today at franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. A U.S. Supreme Court decision in a federal bribery case out of Indiana could impact the case federal prosecutors have brought against longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, as well as the guilty verdict handed down in the ComEd 4 corruption case. Joining me to discuss this is Illinois Associate Editor Greg Bishop. Greg, you've been covering the corruption charges against Madigan since the beginning. Let's start with this Supreme Court decision in the Indiana bribery case and how it's going to impact Madigan in the ComEd 4 cases.
Yeah, so we were anticipating this ruling, Snyder versus U.S., dealing with a mayor out of Indiana that was charged with corruption. And the story there is that case going through the courts all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, when they decided to take it, it's indicated that the outcome could possibly impact the cases here in Illinois and across the country where there might be corruption cases of public officials charged with bribery. Now, this case was heard earlier this year at the U.S. Supreme Court, and earlier this week, they released their ruling. Now, in anticipation of the ruling being released sometime this summer, earlier this year, federal judges in two separate cases that are actually connected, dealing with former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan and the ComEd 4, which is a former CEO of Commonwealth Edison, a couple of lobbyists, and a close associate to Madigan being charged and actually found guilty last year in what federal prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise, a nearly decade-long scheme for Madigan to use his official office to get favorable no-show jobs and contracts for his associates in exchange for favorable legislation for the utility. So we, of course, been tracking this case ever since Madigan was considered public official A back in 2020, in the summer of 2020. So the speculation around the charges against Madigan simmered for a good 2 years before he was eventually charged with 22 counts of corruption. Then you had the ComEd 4 go to trial. They were found guilty. A sentencing date for that trial was set, but the judge said because of this lingering Supreme Court's bribery case, you've got the possibility of it impacting whatever might happen in the outcome. So they delayed the sentencing for the ComEd 4. They also, a separate judge in the Madigan case, he was set to go to trial in April of this year. And a judge said, well, we've got this lingering case with the U.S. Supreme Court that could deal with the federal bribery statute. So they decided to postpone Madigan's case until October. So with that ruling now out from the U.S. Supreme Court, what does it do? Well, it essentially narrowed the federal bribery statute to only focus on acts of quid pro quo before an official act from an elected official, not after the fact. So essentially, Dan, from how I understand it in the ruling, if you and I were to exchange something before you, hypothetical elected official, goes and makes an official act, steers legislation to favor me. If I gave you something before that, well, that would be bribery. But if after the fact, it's merely me just giving you a campaign contribution or giving you a gift of some kind as a gratuity for the official act you took, that's not bribery. So that seems to be the takeaway from the U.S. Supreme Court. How this is going to impact Madigan's case, how it's going to impact the ComEd 4 guilty verdict, how it's possibly going to impact the sentencing that we saw this week of former Chicago Alderman Ed Burke. He was sentenced to 2 years and $2 million fine for corrupt acts that he was found guilty of. Right. So it still is yet to be seen how exactly this U.S. Supreme Court's ruling really is going to impact all of these corruption cases here in the state of Illinois.
Now, you talked yesterday to an observer, someone who's in the know on the legal front, Greg, yesterday, and if memory serves, he told you that it could impact maybe 5 or so counts of the 22 counts that Madigan faces.
Yeah, so there's obviously a slew of different charges against Madigan, again from what federal prosecutors called Madigan Enterprise. And David Parker, a professor at St. Xavier University who focuses on white collar crime type of cases, and he researches these types of things. And he said, from his understanding, is not all of Madigan's cases charges are going to be impacted by this. So he foresees the possibility that there could be some change in scope that federal prosecutors take because of this. And even there's been a new docket entry at the federal court in Madigan's case that signifies that there could be a conference of sorts for all sides to come together and determine what happens next. I think we'll still see Madigan go to trial. Will he face the entirety of the 22 counts, or will federal prosecutors pare that down? We'll be on the edge of our seat watching that closely and reporting out at thecentersquare.com.
And on the ComEd 4 case, which has already gone to a jury has already weighed the evidence, found the 4 executives and lobbyists for the state's Illinois' largest utility company guilty of charges related to the Madigan case, offering no work jobs and other favors to Madigan. We talked to the Center Square fellow Illinois reporter Brett Rowland, talked to the attorney for one of those defendants in the case, and he told us that he expects to get a new trial out of it. That would be a significant impact of that Supreme Court decision.
Well, especially when you consider all of the undercover video and phone calls and wire recordings that were presented in the ComEd 4 trial. Are we going to have to revisit all of those again and report those out? And which ones might be impacted by this? Because one thing's clear, in reviewing a lot of that content that was coming out of the federal court, all the evidence federal prosecutors had, it was at least clear to the jury that there was corruption going on with, a lobbyist talking to Mike McLean about setting up jobs for this, that, and the other, and getting Madigan Associates in his ward, positions with ComEd, and the whole thing. We're probably going to have to relive if indeed the defense for the ComEd 4 moved forward with a new trial post the ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court.
And keep in mind, too, this is just the defense attorney. The defense attorney is going to skew something like this in favor of their client, his or her clients or whatever. So we don't know that for sure. There has not been a hearing set in the ComEd 4 trial as a result of this. However, the judge in the Madigan case says he told the Center Square today that he does want to move forward with the October trial date, regardless of how this may or may not change the prosecutor's case against the former House Speaker. Final closing comments on this before we move on, Greg?
We've been waiting for the Madigan trial for months upon months. I mean, way back even in 2020 when he was just public official A. Everybody was waiting for that next shoe to drop. We thought we would see that trial in April, but with this delay, I think we're all just anxiously awaiting for that next shoe to drop and just exactly how that's going to land. We'll be watching closely at thecentersquare.com.
Well, why don't we stick with the Supreme Court case? Greg, you've been writing, you've been the top reporter in the state of Illinois covering the gun ban that Illinois enacted a couple of years ago, and all of the legal challenges both in state and federal court related to that new law banning 170 some semi-automatic handguns and rifles. Supreme Court also could affect the gun law and the challenges to the gun law. You wrote about that this week. Tell us.
Yeah, so first on the state's gun ban, you've got the case on preliminary grounds still being considered by the U.S. Supreme Court, and we have yet to see them report out if they're going to take that challenge, that group of challenges, on a preliminary basis. So people are still holding out to see if the U.S. Supreme Court's going to take that on a preliminary basis. Meanwhile, on the merits, looking for final judgment in the Southern District, that case apparently now, without the U.S. Supreme Court announcing their intentions one way or the other, the case on the merits in the Southern District is moving forward. They've got a bench trial set for September 16th. But back to the U.S. Supreme Court rulings that were released recently concerning firearms. They released one ruling that last week dealt with the ATF banning bump stocks, and essentially said that the ATF, and they cannot, by rule, make law. Because after the 2017 mass shooting in Las Vegas, where 60 people were killed and hundreds of others were injured, it was believed that the assailant there utilized bump stocks, which attached to rifles and increased the firing rate of those rifles, those semi-automatic rifles. And the Supreme Court ruled that attaching a device to a semi-automatic firearm to increase the rate of fire does not make it a machine gun. And that clearly delineates the difference between semi-automatic firearms and machine guns, where in Illinois, the state has essentially argued that semi-automatic firearms they banned can be regulated because they're the cousin of machine guns that the military can have. So a lot of gun rights advocates in the state of Illinois are looking at the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling as something that's going to bolster their claims. But it's not just the majority opinion in the bump stock case they're pointing to. Gun rights advocates are also pointing to the dissent in the bump stock case. While the dissent, typically is not what's going to determine, the outcomes here, you could still look at the dissent as to get a better understanding of the thinking of some of these Supreme Court justices. And even the liberal justices that dissented in the bump stock ban override, they admitted that semi-automatic firearms are common. And that's another argument that we're going to see debated in the Southern District as to, can you ban commonly owned firearms? And obviously, this is going to get even more fascinating as we get to that September 16th bench trial in the Southern District. So that's one case that was dealt with at the U.S. Supreme Court, overturning the bump stock ban. Another case that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on late last week dealt with orders of protection, domestic violence orders of protection. And if somebody is the subject of that, can they have their Second Amendment rights restricted? The Supreme Court came out and said, yes, they can. And it was a 8-1 decision here, so almost unanimous. But ultimately, what they said is there has to be due process here. You can't just have a court say, okay, this individual can't have their Second Amendment rights without there being true due process. So gun control advocates in Illinois looked at that Supreme Court ruling and they said, this bolsters our efforts to enhance Illinois' red flag laws. But gun rights advocates point to the Supreme Court ruling and say, well, if they want to enhance the state's red flag laws, they're going to have to follow the precedent set in the U.S. Supreme Court ruling by requiring that there be due process, meaning some kind of court hearing where evidence can be presented and the back and forth can happen and a decision can be made. So again, fascinating to see how the U.S. Supreme Court, after years of these cases making their way through the judiciary, ultimately coming to some resolution, and how it trickles down to impact everything from, not just corruption allegations, but even the Second Amendment and administrative agencies' authority to make law.
And listeners can keep up with all of the Center Square's coverage on Illinois' gun laws and the legal fights over it, and on, of course, the Madigan and ComEd 4 corruption cases at thecentersquare.com. Greg, moving on, something else we've been writing about with some frequency at thecentersquare.com for the past couple of years out of Chicago, the migrant crisis there. About 40,000 migrants have been bused to Chicago and surrounding communities since President Biden's been in office, and the mass flow flood of illegal immigrants crossing the border, mostly across the southern border, and then Texas Governor Greg Abbott busing many of them to so-called sanctuary cities such as Chicago and elsewhere. More news this week on that, in that Governor Pritzker announced the opening of a couple new shelters specifically for migrants, and there was some backlash in the city about that.
Yeah, so the state announced additional taxpayer-supported shelters to serve the migrants arriving in Chicago, and 3 different facilities in a joint effort with the city of Chicago, Cook County, and the state of Illinois, looking to have a total capacity of around 2,000 new non-citizen migrants that'll be able to be housed there. And the state saying that this is, all part of the efforts of the Pritzker administration and utilizing over $180 million and in conjunction with millions of dollars from Cook County and millions of dollars from the city of Chicago, all taxpayer funds to pay for this type of housing. But not everybody's on board with this. A Chicago resident told our colleague Katrina Peterson, somebody who immigrated here from Brazil, that they pushed to close down one particular shelter because of the chaos it was bringing about in their community in Gage Park. And the resident even shared video and photos of some of the problematic behavior they had seen in their neighborhood because of non-citizen migrants being there. She says that they smoked cannabis 24/7. They went to the bathroom on trees in the park. They would engage in explicit actions in parks in front of children, just really chaotic, they said. And they worry that these announcements of more migrant shelters coming to Chicago are really going to just reopen those wounds and cause more problems and frustrations for residents living in these various communities. And then you have the likes of State Representative Adam Niemerg, who raised concern that all of these dollars, millions and millions of dollars, are being put into this, an estimated $3 billion in total. Wow. Since the crisis really ramped up. I mean, it's not just the housing, it's the food, it's the education, it's the legal services that taxpayers are subsidizing, and it's the non-citizen health care that taxpayers are also subsidizing in the state of Illinois. All of this adding up, and Niemerg says it's a shame that a lot of the taxpayers who are here are being pushed to the side to take care of these citizens that the governor calls asylum seekers, but others question the legitimacy of them seeking asylum to the United States.
Certainly another story that is not going away anytime soon. Moving on, though, Greg, we've written also at thecentersquare.com about the Governor Pritzker's plans to shut down 2 state prisons, to tear them down, rebuild them. Interesting development this week about a death at one of those 2 at Stateville. Tell us about that.
Yeah, 51-year-old Michael Broadway recently earned a college degree while being incarcerated. He died from asthma, and his family says it was made worse by the conditions at Stateville. This comes as, of course, the Pritzker administration announced a $900 million plan to close and replace Stateville and Logan Correctional Center near Lincoln over the next 3 to 5 years. There's been a lot of pushback on this from the union that represents prison employees, worried about jobs, and also worried about the condition that inmates may have to endure in any kind of transition back and forth while they do this work. So a lot of debate about this. But the governor this week, he highlighted that with the problems there are in particular in Stateville, he says he's listening to everybody involved, but he needs to make that decision to move forward because it's not just the inmates, but also the correctional staff that work at those facilities. And it seems to be recognized that Stateville is in bad shape. It's a prison that's been around since the 20s, and it's even those who walked and toured the facility, like State Representative C.D. Davidsmeyer, he said it's clear that Stateville needs substantial work. Is that the case for Logan, for the Logan Correctional Facility? Others arguing that does not need to be torn down. It can be rehabilitated. It can be fixed up. So which direction the governor ultimately goes in this, we'll be watching closely because it's going to be a $900 million adventure, which that is just an estimate. Could they come below that number? Dan, with inflation as it is, I mean, over the next 3 to 5 years, who knows? It could balloon even more, well above $1 billion plus.
Not to mention the jobs that would be impacted there. Of course, Governor Pritzker and his administration had said, the prison guards and other staff would have the option to move to another nearby facility during the interim. But with construction, if they do tear these down and rebuild, I mean, that's a multi-year project, I'm sure, so they'd be without jobs. Closing comments here, Greg?
Yeah, and I think that the plan has not been made clear by the Pritzker administration, and the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, which is supposed to give a recommendation one way or the other, was unable to do so, with some of the members, a bipartisan group of members, raising question about, well, where is this plan? Who's going to be involved? Who's the contractor designing? Who's the contractor tearing down and rebuilding? Those details have not been as clear.
Thank you for joining us today, Greg. Listeners can keep up with all of the stories we talked about and more at thecentersquare.com.
BP added more than $130 billion to the U.S. economy over the past 2 years by making investments from coast to coast. Investments like building EV charging hubs in Washington state and starting up new infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. It's and, not or. See what doing both means for energy nationwide at bp.com/investing in America.
Ready to ignite your future? The Loudoun County Combined Fire and Rescue System is recruiting volunteers now. No experience? No problem. LCCFRS provides free training and certifications. Network with a diverse group of people while making a real difference. Whether you want to be a firefighter, EMT, chaplain, or help administratively, we've got a role for you. Open new doors and boost your resume with the Loudoun County Combined Fire and Rescue System. Start now at opennewdoors.org. That's opennewdoors.org.
We all have our own behind-the-wheel persona. Are you a windows down, sing-along to your favorite song, seat lean back kind of driver? Or perhaps an AC blasting, podcast on, hugging the wheel kind of driver? However you move through life, Atlantic Union Bank is on board because we agree things should be done your way, especially banking. Work with someone you trust who's there when you need them for all the ways you bank. Call, schedule a video appointment, or make a pit stop at an Atlantic Union Bank branch to learn more. Atlantic Union Bank, any way you bank.